The Washington Monument strategy is very misleading. To understand what it is, we first need to know what marginal utility is and how it affects this strategy. In economics, marginal utility is described as the additional utility provided by one additional unit of consumption. In other words, the benefit gained from consuming one more of something. So diminishing marginal utility is the idea that as you increase the input of an item, the more of it that you intake, the less marginal utility will be output. So the best way to do, or I guess the best way to understand what that is through an example. And my example is with going to the movies or eating popcorn and having a soda. The more sodas you have, the less use for soda you will have, or the less joy of soda. If you sit there and have 4 sodas, the first one might give you 30 marginal utility, and the second one will probably give you 25, and the third one will decrease, so on and so forth. And the law of diminishing marginal utility, it states that as a person receives more of something, whether it's a good or another resource, the additional marginal gains tend to become smaller. So when it comes to the Washington Monument strategy, it's used at all levels of the government. The name comes from a tactic that was used by the National Park Service. They had lawmakers threatening to cut their budget. And so what the National Park Service did was they told everybody that, oh, if our budget gets cut, we're going to cut the amount of hours that the Washington Monument is open, and they were going to limit the public from being able to go visit the Washington Monument. So the name comes from that, and it was a tactic that they used that it's a tactic or a strategy that was used to inflict a form of an emotional response from the public. So by going out and threatening to cut back on a very popular monument, the citizens went out publicly and backed the National Park Service, and they didn't support the budget cuts. They actually stood against it, and they said, don't cut their budget, because of how much they loved going to the Washington Monument. In the terms of the marginal utility and diminishing, it's misleading because we tend to think of that as a way that we can get away with it, but that's on a very public stage. In personal budgeting, it makes much more sense to cut the items with the lowest marginal utility. They're not going to be missed as much. And the Washington Monument strategy, the reason why it worked is because it wasn't a personal budget change. They're a government department, and they decided that if their budget was cut, they'd cut the hours of operation. And they went out and told everybody, you know, we're going to cut the operational hours of a publicly loved monument. The marginal utility of the Washington Monument is very high. So by threatening to sacrifice it, they made the whole country feel their budget cut. And the whole country decided to oppose the lawmakers from enacting it. Most things in personal lives that bring the highest marginal utility are not requirements to live. Many people enjoy, like I said earlier, going to the movies and will spend money on it because the marginal utility is very high. They also enjoy buying a large popcorn and a soda because the marginal utility on that is high, but it's not quite as high as just going to the movies. In personal finances, most budget cuts are not easily fought against. If you're told by your boss that you're going to get a salary, your salary is going to be cut and you're going to have a lower salary. If you told your boss, well, if you cut my salary, I'm not going to go to the movies on Friday, they're likely not going to care. They're not going to sit there and try and raise your salary back. They're still going to lower it. Instead of going and trying to fight it and, you know, getting rid of your highest marginal utility of the week, you're a lot better off cutting items with lower marginal utility, like the large soda and popcorn that you would be buying when you go to see the movie. Instead of buying a large soda and a large popcorn, you could get a small soda and a small popcorn, but you would still be able to go and see the movie. You would sacrifice something of lower marginal utility in a real-life personal finance sense. Is it possible for total utility to increase while marginal utility diminishes? Yes, it's actually very common, in fact. total utility is able to increase as long as marginal utility is positive. With marginal utility, each new use of the marginal utility decreases. So every time you use an object, the marginal utility will decrease, but the total utility will increase. Total utility will actually reach its maximum when the marginal utility becomes zero. So the law of diminishing marginal utility, it actually directly answers this question. The law of diminishing marginal utility states that as a person receives more of something, whether it is a good or another resource, the additional marginal gains tend to become smaller. So it's very common that as your total utility increases, your marginal utility will decrease.